Hi, everybody. Welcome. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. We are at the roundtable, virtual roundtable and podcast on price gouging. And here we are with leaders from Proskauer, the international law firm, and Duff and Phelps, a Kroll's business, where we're going to discuss some interesting new and old trends related to the pricing gouging space. And let me just starting by providing some context here. What is really the topic that we're talking about? And I think that the pandemic really brought back this important issue to the table, where basically we have rules all over the world where sellers cannot increase pricing dramatically, especially when they try to take advantage of certain emergency situations, both on the local and national and international front. And as we saw during the pandemic, during COVID, many institutions around the world did take advantage of the emergency situations, and prices really moved up dramatically. We all remember the stories about toilet paper or other commodities and goods. Interestingly enough, when you look all over the United States and the world, the topic is relevant when you think about the supply chain, all aspects of supply chain, different sectors in the market, from distribution to wholesaling. And I think that it's important to understand that it's really a wide phenomenon. It's not really limited to one particular sector or subsector, as some people thought during the pandemic. And also in terms of legislation, as we hear from our experts here around the virtual table, it's really driven by local legislation, national legislation, and sometimes even international. What we're going to talk about today is really what is it about, what are the rules that we see in the US, in Europe, some other parts of the world? What are the new trends when it comes to legislation in this space? Why compliance is so critical? Why international companies and national companies should be aware of this important issue? What companies can do in order to assess the risk, mitigate the risk. And once you think about certain enforcement procedures, we will try to share with you today some cutting-edge examples, how companies should think about these procedures, how to think about damages, for example, how to quantify the damages, and really maybe most importantly, since so many of us think that the pandemic is almost over, especially some parts of the Western world, and we think that we're back to normal. As we start thinking about the next couple of years, I think that one of the conclusions from today's discussion will be and should be that the whole world of price gouging is not over. Some of the rules are still being shaped as we speak. Enforcement cases probably are here to stay, and we will see many of them in the future. And most importantly, companies definitely should think very seriously what can be done today in order to mitigate the risk and also deal more wisely with future cases. We have a stellar roundtable, as I mentioned before. Let me just introduce my friends and colleagues here. Let me start with Tasneem Azad, who is speaking to us all the way from the UK, from London. She's a managing director with Duff and Phelps, Kroll's business. She's actually leading our EMEA disputes practice, and she has a great experience when it comes to pricing and antitrust cases. Thank you very much, Tasneem, for joining us today. Then we have John Ingrassia from the States. John is an off-counsel with Proskauer. He's one of the leaders of the antitrust team over there. He has a deep expertise and experience in various cases related to corporate events like mergers and acquisitions and joint venture, and also specifically super relevant to today's discussion. John was involved in many cases related to anti-competitive measures, including price control. And then also from Proskauer Rose, we have Shannon. Hi, Shannon. Thank you for joining us. Shannon McGowan. and she's part of the antitrust team, and also with deep experience in the price gouging space. And then finally, we have Charles Parekh. Thank you very much, Charles, for joining us. He's part of the Duff and Phelps team. Charlie has done a lot of work with respect to price control, anti-competitive activities, especially when it comes to the public sector, the financial world, and healthcare services as well. Even more specifically, I think it's quite important for today's discussion. Charlie did a lot of work and research how to quantify the damages in these kind of cases, what kind of statistical and other models we can actually use in order to understand a little bit better the damages part of the enforcement process. So hopefully by now we are all on the same page, and let's start with you, John. John, I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks that the rules are quite complex. It's not really an exclusive federal game. It's not exclusive state-based legislation. Can you share with us what are the rules that we have to think about when we think about this area, both nationally in the U.S. and internationally?
Thanks, Effie, and thanks for the introduction and for those remarks. I'd be happy to talk about that. And I did want to highlight, one of the things that you mentioned, that this is not over. The fact that we're gladly coming to the end of maybe the health emergency in lots of places, maybe is just the beginning of these claims that we may be seeing now for years to come for what happened during the course of the emergency. In terms of sort of where the authority lies for these kinds of pricing restrictions, it's far and wide, and it's not limited really by sector. It's not limited by geography. It's not limited by jurisdiction, and you see lots of sources. And so in the U.S., I would say the main source of pricing restrictions or price gouging rules and regulations are state statutes. State statutes layered with executive orders that have been and emergency orders that have been put in place in various states. That's the main source, but we also have federal legislation at some level. So we do have the Defense Production Act in the U.S., which does address price gouging, among other things. It addresses price gouging in a more limited way. The Defense Production Act is focusing on a specific subset of products that may be relevant to the particular emergency at issue, and it's really focusing on things like hoarding. So not pricing per se, but where someone's really trying to more affirmatively take advantage of an emergency. I would differentiate that federal legislation with the U.S. pricing control, with the state U.S. pricing controls, where a lot of them really don't focus on sort of what your intent or objective is. And they're really very much strict liability rules where you have pricing restrictions and you're not able to price at a certain level, even if you are a sort of good actor and maybe you're just a bit over the threshold. Also, it's not just U.S., as we talked about. It's just really, as this pandemic has impacted economies on a worldwide basis, jurisdictions around the world have responded in a number of ways. And so we've seen in Brazil, for example, with the Antitrust Enforcement Agency there, CADE, investigating a number of pharmaceutical businesses in the medical industry for price gouging, and that's been very specific with respect to price gouging. Also, we've seen in Europe, even though a lot of the European countries don't have specific price gouging legislation as you might see in U.S. states, for instance, they do have rules that reach this kind of behavior. And so we're going after things like unfair methods of competition, for instance, and we've seen that in a number of jurisdictions in Europe. And even beyond, really, it extends out. We've seen, China is active, South Africa, and then even in the U.S., if you're looking at, non-state entities like Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa. So this really has covered sort of the widest possible geography, the widest possible scope in terms of, jurisdictions and sectors. It's really not a sector-specific issue, even though it sort of feels like that at first blush when you're looking at things like PPE and hand sanitizer. And if you're looking at the Defense Production Act under federal legislation in the U.S., for instance, that may be more sector-specific. But most of the rules in the U.S., the state statutes in the U.S., are not sector-specific. That's not always true. There are some states that are more limited, but many of them again, cover wide swaths of the economy. And so this is where folks get caught up in this sort of unknowingly, right? Where you might be, sort of national retailer or distributor of some sort. You might have a range of products, not recognizing that you're sort of within the scope of the emergency. It might be something that's not obvious. We've seen cases, and our colleagues here will talk about some of the examples, but we've seen cases in industries that you would not expect to see price gouging claims in. And so, that's really where we're trying to highlight these issues. Some of it is not obvious. There are obvious pieces with respect to face masks, and those get taken care of pretty quickly and easily. But there are a lot of non-obvious issues that we think it's important for folks to understand from a compliance standpoint, and so that's why we're talking about this.
That's great, John. And just to follow up on one specific thing that I think many of our viewers and listeners are interested in, because it's such a choppy regulative environment. Correct me if I'm wrong, sometimes even if you don't have a specific rule, what we've seen during the pandemic and we may see over the next couple of years is that states and countries take existing rules, let's say executive orders or other pieces of legislation, and they just apply it in the context of price gouging because they really want to do something in order to stop the pricing from going up very quickly in real time. Is this correct?
It's correct, and we've seen it worldwide, and we've also seen it in the U.S. Not every state in the U.S. has a price gouging law on the books. More do now than did a year ago. But in the beginning of the pandemic, governors were using things like unfair methods of competition, different kinds of antitrust and competition rules to sort of get at this kind of behavior in other ways. And in a lot of cases, those were successful. But what we've seen over the course of the year are many states that did not have price gouging legislation on the books now sort of bring that to the front.
Thank you, John. And we will talk in a few minutes with Tasneem a lot about the compliance part of the story and what companies can do in order to make sure that they adjust very quickly to this changing, fast-changing regulatory environment that you just shared with us. So thank you for that, John. And to you, Shannon, let's just talk a little bit about some of the case studies, examples, because people wonder, is this real? Do they actually go after all these companies? Because, prices go up for all types of reasons. It's a fast moving market. The pandemic as a case study, of course, was a once in a lifetime event. Can you share with us what enforcement agencies have been doing in this space?
Absolutely. So we've seen really active state enforcement throughout since the beginning of the pandemic. And we've seen suits brought, as John said, in a variety of sectors and about a variety of products. So as you mentioned at the beginning, you have your PPE, such as masks, hand sanitizer, cleaning products. All of those were traditionally brought against retailers and retailers who had increased prices, sometimes by over 200%. And not all of those cases have some have been settled and some have been dismissed. But we have seen a lot of those cases. But as John mentioned, we've seen a lot of other issues. So it hasn't been just limited to the kind of COVID-specific products. We've seen groceries, both retailers and suppliers. So not only have grocery stores come under scrutiny for prices for groceries, but also the suppliers of those food products who are selling to retailers have also come under scrutiny from state attorneys general. Generally, we've also seen gasoline and natural gas. So those came not only with the shutdown of the Colonial Pipeline in the U.S., but also before that, we saw states attorney generals looking at the prices for retail gasoline. And then one of the big areas that we've seen action both in the state enforcement level and from private plaintiffs as well has been against online platforms. So looking at how they're setting their prices and whether or not they're restricting the prices that sellers are setting on their platforms. And these cases have raised some really interesting legal questions, and in addition to the general price gouging questions, and it provides an opportunity to look at how businesses might be able to defend against some of these pricing restrictions in light of some of the other legal regimes that are out there. And then one really interesting area we saw recently is cases being brought in the real estate and housing sector. So many state laws actually apply to housing or to even to hotels. So in the wake of winter storms or other kinds of emergencies, we've seen cases brought against hotels, and then rental prices for single unit family housing have also come under scrutiny. So in these suits, the enforcement agencies are looking for things like restitution, fines, and civil penalties. And also some really unique, and I'm sure Charlie will speak to this, some really unique kind of systems for consumer credit. But most recently, we've seen an increase, not necessarily in state enforcement actions, but in private plaintiffs bringing cases on their own, because the statute of limitations will continue for years sometimes after the states of emergency have been lifted. So we've seen more private plaintiffs bringing cases against online platforms and natural gas suppliers, not the retailers, but the actual suppliers. And so we expect to see that kind of continue even after the states of emergency have ended.
That's super interesting and helpful. Especially, I found your point about e-commerce platforms and the housing market quite interesting, because I think you're absolutely right. I think most people, when they think about price gouging, they think about the kind of the usual suspects. And we mentioned some of these products and sectors, but I think what we see now in the market, according to your description of the enforcement process or future cases, is really kind of the new cutting edge areas where we really want to make sure that the prices they follow the right regulation as we discussed before. And we will talk a little bit more about kind of specific sectors and what companies can do in order to deal with this changing reality. Tasneem, let's talk a little bit about the compliance part of the story. So companies, executives, people who listen to us, they say, okay, so I understand that this is something that I should pay attention to. It's something that I really have to take into account. But then there are two questions. One is how I really assess the risk, because obviously I have so many products, I'm in so many geography. These are moving targets. Sometimes it's hard to control in real time. And the second question, of course, is that there are so many challenges when I execute compliance programs, what I have to really think about and to focus on when I build my compliance program. So can you share with us your experience and what you've seen in the market and what kind of issues you raise with your clients?
Absolutely, Effie. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joining this discussion here today. Turning to your question, you're absolutely right. The compliance challenge here for firms is that, no matter how efficient and well run they may be, they may just find themselves running afoul of these rules, despite all their best efforts. Because as John pointed out, the vast majority of firms here have good intentions. They're not looking to exploit vulnerable customers, particularly in this time of crisis. So the problem that these companies face in general is that, supply chains, just as you said, Effie, are really complex. They're multifaceted. They have numerous layers to them. They are mostly global, or at least regional, if not global. And they have an intricate web of relationships amongst their teams responsible for, say, planning, sourcing, production, distribution, retail, as Shannon pointed out. In many of these cases, price setting is likely to be decentralized. In other words, the prices are not being set at the top by HQ and being dictated to local teams. Rather, they're being set at a local level, possibly, also addressing local demand and supply conditions. So all that means is that, compliance becomes a really quite non-trivial exercise, because first of all, you need to stay abreast of the evolving rules. As John has pointed out, they change frequently. They vary by jurisdiction. There are so many different rules and changing rules to keep, to keep knowledge of. Second, there's the challenge of adjusting internal systems to respond as rapidly as possible. All of this might be easier said than done. Systems may be automated, they may be very difficult to update. You might need to retrain large bodies of staff. There may be challenges in establishing complex processes for, say, monitoring and reporting. So, you raise a relevant point here. What's a firm to do in this setting? And you're absolutely right. I think a very good first step is to start with a risk assessment. Why a risk assessment? I think, to help to ascertain how likely it is that the rules will bite in this case, and how material the implications might be if the rules do bite. So what would a risk assessment look like? I guess it would ask questions like, which and how many products are likely to be caught by the rules? Are they a substantive part of the business? How frequently are prices adjusted? Who adjusts those prices? Are local demand conditions considered when setting prices? Next, how well trained are teams in compliance? What is their current awareness level around price gouging? And a whole host of other questions can be, addressed to look at the risk and analyze the risk. And I think together, looking and assessing the risks will help in starting to develop, not just a short-term compliance solution, but a long-term compliance solution as well.
That's great. And I think what we're doing here today, bringing together both economists and lawyers and other advisors, I think it's a key, because I think what you raise is really kind of interdisciplinary approach to the question of pricing and where we stand on that, because obviously based on your analysis of compliance and risk management and risk assessment, there is no one clear answer from the beginning. And that brings me to Charlie. Charlie, you spend a lot of time thinking about implementation of some kind of immediate solutions in antitrust more generally when people think and companies think about pricing. Can you share with us a couple of thoughts about what companies can actually do, taking into account the fact that companies are different in terms of size, obviously small to very large, in terms of sector, in terms of geographies, and I'm sure that many of the proposed solutions are not necessarily similar.
Sure. Thank you. I think that the solutions really boil down to monitoring, training, and visibility. In terms of monitoring, you have to know what your prices are and when they're changing, and you have to have a direct channel between management and those who are observing the local prices. As Tasneem mentioned in the risk assessment, who is setting the prices, and are those prices taken off of a pricing sheet, or are they set locally just through local inputs and on the fly, which is sometimes done. And so you have to have this sort of compliance hotline where those that are setting the prices and observing the prices can talk to a centralized management structure and say, this is what we're seeing, and these are the prices. And then along that monitoring, you have to have a long-term data and technical solution that often takes the form of an automated system that is monitoring and understanding every price change for every product in every geography, something that humans can't do necessarily, especially for any sort of medium-sized or larger company that is multi-jurisdictional with many products. And so that technical solution has to be implemented. And then from a training standpoint, you have to train your managers and anyone setting prices and observing prices as to what these price gouging or pricing regulations are about. And the managers have to understand the rules and regulations, and then also have to understand what to document and what to know when prices change. Do they change because of cost? Do they change because of demand? and those have different implications when it comes to the different regulations. And then finally, and this is, I think, a very difficult one, but there has to be this visibility into customer complaints. In the end, customers are the ones that are paying the price changes, and they're going to speak to their local sales representative. They're going to speak directly to management, but those things can't be ignored, because in the end, they're also the ones that may end up complaining or engaging in civil suits in terms of price changes. And if you can often avoid any sort of unpleasantness, legal or otherwise, if you just listen to those customer complaints. So monitoring, training, and visibility are really what it's all about.
These are great points, Charlie. Before I get to Shannon about some of the legal cases, out of curiosity, you mentioned that technology a few times, and obviously today we have many more tools than in the past. Out of curiosity, how do you think the whole AI, big data kind of approach to pricing more generally going to change the way companies respond in such a decentralized process, respond to this issue?
Right. So over time, AI is going to become just a major tool that companies can use, because it can help filter out things that don't need to be looked at, but also alert companies to things that they didn't necessarily think to look at, and that's really important. And that combines and dovetails right into the other thing you mentioned, which is our ability to process big data. When you're talking about millions and millions of transactions, thousands of prices, hundreds or thousands of jurisdictions, because these state regulations may also be followed by local regulations, and then national regulations and international regulations, and all of that. You have to have both the ability to process these things and understand them, and that's what the AI and big data solutions will do. And while they can be costly to implement up front, they're really going to save just uncountable dollars in the future, both from just the ongoing monitoring piece of this, but also, of course, the damages, which we'll talk about later, can often be treble damages. And so you absolutely have to avoid that, because it becomes, in some ways, bet the company litigation if you really get caught and penalized from these things.
And the technology itself will get cheaper and cheaper over time. That's just the nature of things. Now it may be a little bit more expensive because the technology has been created as we speak, but over time, like history, it's going to repeat itself. Technology will be cheaper, much easier for companies to implement these kind of big data tools in order to save money down the road. You mentioned litigation, and you mentioned some of the cases, Charlie. Let's move on and speak a little bit about the cases themselves, because sometimes companies do all the right things. They implement many of the kind of strategies, Charlie, that you recommended, and we heard from Tasneem as well about on the compliance side, how to think about the risk assessment. But the reality is that eventually many of them will face litigation. And there is something about this particular space that cases are perceived as very complex, very challenging on both sides, both on the prosecution side and on the corporate side. And I think most importantly in this context, Shannon, it's not clear to me what kind of arguments, what is really the defense when companies need to face the issue of price gouging, and they need to show how they made decisions, what were the prices in real time. Can you share with us a little bit about the actual cases, the challenges of the litigation, and what companies actually argue when they face the claims?
Yeah, so I think some of the biggest challenges with these cases is really just the patchwork of regulations that are at play right now. And so it's important for for defendants to really make sure that the prosecution is meeting every single element of the claim, which can be very difficult because it's also something that the defendants need to understand. So these statutes get triggered at different times and in different ways. And so while one state may trigger a statute at one point, another state is going to be different. And each state has you measure your baseline price differently. So understanding what formula is being applied to different products and at what point in time they were triggered is super important and makes for a lot of complications. In addition to just the baseline price formula being different, you also have to think about which specific products are covered. So we've seen cases where enforcers believe that a product is covered by the statute, but when you actually look at the plain language of the statute, you see that that product is not actually covered by the statute. Some are open for interpretation, but others are quite clear. They enumerate very specific elements, like they will say gasoline, but not like suppliers. Wholesale suppliers would not be covered. So if a state enforcer or a private plaintiff is looking to bring a case and they're bringing it against a wholesaler, that wholesaler needs to understand that they might not be covered by the statute. Instead, just a retailer would be covered by the statute. And then the other thing is just the calculations, which Charlie's able to speak to as well. But when you have so you kind of have two buckets I like to think of the kind of regulations. One either caps prices at a particular percentage, or others prohibit excessive cost increases. And so when you're looking at those, you need to understand what formula are you applying that would constitute either excessive or would exceed the statutory cap. And for the statutory cap, oftentimes those can be extended in the case of cost increases. And most, if not all states, account in some way, shape, or form for increased costs to sellers. But the formulas for calculating that are different. So it might be increased cost plus 10% in some states, or it might be increased cost plus your margin plus 10%. And so these are all factors that need to be considered when you need to make sure that the prosecution or the plaintiff is using the correct formula, starting on the correct day, covering the correct product. And also recognizing that not all, like I said earlier, not all courts are just blindly accepting, that, oh, this is a price increase and therefore violates the statute. You really have to put the prosecution to the test to make sure that they've actually met every single one of the elements of the claim.
And that's probably explains why, Shannon, these procedures are very, very long. I don't need to convince this group around the table here and the listeners why litigation and arbitration sometimes takes years and years and why it's so complex. But I think many of the points that you raised just reminded us why some of these cases are even longer because of all these various components of the case. And you also mentioned the numbers. So let's talk a little bit about the numbers, which is a very important part of the story, because obviously once you show that the particular product and geography is actually covered by the statute, it's not enough. We have to get into the numbers. And John, when you reflect on your own experience and you think about the cases that we're going to see over the next couple of years, which we're all interested in, how do we think about financial damages when the authorities try to understand the damages and how to take advantage of that? What do you see out there?
Yeah, thanks. There's a lot to think about there, because damage claims can come from two places, right? So you've got your state enforcers or your governmental enforcers, and then you've got your private plaintiffs, and I'll take them separately. With respect to government enforcement, the damages claims can be substantial. I mean, there are things like restitution, penalties, which can range, from a couple of $1,000 per sale up to, even 25,000 or more. You've got, as Charlie mentioned, the potential for treble damages, and so all of those things are in play, and it's real. We've seen this. We've seen these enforcement actions in Idaho, for example. There was an enforcement action against gas retailers where they entered into a settlement to a $1.5 million settlement. And what was really interesting about that case, and I think unfair, is that the price, in fact, didn't go up. but their cost went down. So these things get very nuanced, and so in that case, led to a change in the law actually in Idaho, where the law was clarified. A lot of these laws are unclear, as Shannon mentioned. The law is now clearer in Idaho. Too late for these gas retailers, but the law is now clearer in Idaho that the price, in fact, has to go up in order for there to be a price gouging claim. And so all of that plays in, and you have to think about sort of, the state AGs and sort of what their objective and job is and what their incentives are. Of course, it's more than a state AG issue. Government investigations are concerning. They scare people. Nobody wants the government investigations, but in some ways, it's not our biggest concern. Our bigger concern are the private plaintiffs, and I'll talk about why. State AGs and governmental enforcers, they have prosecutorial discretion, right? They're looking for what they might see as egregious cases. They're probably not going to go after the foot fault case. There's a number of reasons for that, right? Scarcity of enforcement resources, maybe public policy. Maybe it's just not worth going after. Think about driving 56 miles an hour in the 55 zone. You're probably not going to get the sirens. But what we care about and what we're concerned about are those cases where private rights of actions exist, and in many states they do. Here you have a whole different set of incentives, and to some extent this emergency has been a wake-up call really for plaintiffs and the plaintiffs bar in terms of sort of the availability of these claims, and we think it'll continue sort of post-pandemic, because states of emergency get activated on some fairly regular basis, on a more localized basis, of course, but you've got your earthquakes and your mudslides and your hurricanes and your tornadoes, and so these things never go away. They're always there in some way. With respect to private plaintiffs, of course, this is an incentive system, right? So now there's an incentive for plaintiffs to identify cases of noncompliance. And even if it's not egregious, even if it's a small sort of foot fault noncompliance issue, that creates the claim, that creates the basis for the claim. And why this is special here, and again, why we're concerned about it are two things: the duration of it, right? So you have 12, 14 months or more of states of emergency activated in a lot of these jurisdictions. So you've had time for these damages to pile up now. Whereas if it was a sort of more localized, more short-term duration state of emergency, the damage to claim might have remained at some smaller level. Now we're looking at nationwide basis, 12 to 14 months plus. So you've had time for these damages claimed to really add up, which again is an incentive for plaintiffs to come forward. That on top of the fact that the statutes of limitations for these claims can run years. So again, as we talked about in the beginning, whereas we're in a good place in terms of the health emergency in a lot of ways, we're really maybe only at the beginning of the legal claims that may result from that, beginning now and for 2 and 3 and 5 years forward. So those are the kinds of things we think about now. That's why compliance really is key. Complying to the letter of the law, especially for the bigger firms that are bigger targets, right? So they might be regional in scope, they might be national in scope, they might have a broad range of products in their portfolio, and that's going to be the target. And the data is now out there and it's available, and to the extent that there was a price in place for 8 months that was above a 10% threshold, it's very easy to calculate those damages and those claims will come forward.
These are great comments, John, and I can tell you that what I've seen with other aspects of the compliance world, whether we're talking about governance or diversity or issues related to data privacy, data management, things that in the past it was just much harder to find, to monitor. Now, because many of these areas, it's much easier to monitor, companies have to adjust. And now we see in compliance teams, people who are responsible specifically for these kind of functions, which makes me think, and this is just kind of a thought with the group, that maybe over the next couple of years, we will see more and more capacity building and expertise within teams, within companies, working with you guys, lawyers, economists, experts, in order to, A, prevent future cases, B, of course, monitor the compliance mechanism, and C, of course, respond in case of a real life case. Which brings me to you, Charlie. Let's talk specifics a little bit for a few minutes about some of these numbers, because as we all know, it's the economy stupid. We heard it before. So it's all about the numbers. And the question is, John mentioned to us that some of these numbers are really significant, but at the end of the day, it's probably hard to quantify. You mentioned some of the tools before. How should we think about the significance of these numbers and what companies can do in order to reduce the numbers?
Right. So I think the first thing to realize is that there are differences between the penalties and the damages. And John had talked a little bit about governmental regulation versus private lawsuits, and those may involve different things. And the penalties may be more formulaic. They may not be. It really depends on the states and regulations, but that may involve understanding how many units were sold, what the actual price increase was. But then you also have to think about damages more generally, and that involves calculating the difference between what actually happened and what would have happened if the price increase or the violation had not occurred. And that often is a very complicated set of calculations, set of estimations, and that's going to be different for every firm, every situation. But there's some things that you can do to make those calculations more precise, more accurate, and easier to do, and that understands, why did the price changes occur? When did they occur? How did they occur? Where did they occur? So knowing the real specifics about the price changes, how many items, how many units were involved? Did the cost change? Did the cost structure change? Were there changes in the markets in general? What was happening with the competition? Did substitutes and complements enter the market? And what kind of revenues and profits were involved? And these are just some of the things that you might need to know about. But what I'm trying to underscore here is that this can be a very complicated, difficult, even sometimes speculative process, and it all comes down to how good are your data. And we've talked already today about all the different monitoring tools that you might use. Well, those help you, obviously, first and foremost, avoid any sort of litigation or regulatory actions. But when that happens, if you've implemented these things and the data are there and ready for you and ready for your experts and your internal compliance experts to have on hand, you can save potentially millions of dollars by having this ready to go. And often winning in the courtroom or in front of regulatory bodies comes down to who has the best data. And if you can show right away that you were well intentioned, and even if you had price increases that may have come afoul of the rules, if they were simply foot faults, which you can show through the data, a lot of this goes away. And so, yes, I'm not going to lie to you. This is going to require expert analysis, both from economists and other pricing experts and legal expert analysis. But it's going to come back to these monitoring questions. Do you have the data to show and prove that what were the actual prices, and what would have things looked like if you hadn't increased prices, and that delta may not be that different, and so the damages might actually be quite low, hopefully.
And as you said before, I think, although you didn't mention the word itself, benchmarking, I think the benchmark is pretty much the most critical component here. And experts like yourself, I'm sure, and you've seen it in other more traditional competitive antitrust cases where parties really work hard to show that the benchmark works in their favor. And I'm sure we're going to see that here as well. And your point about data monitoring and data efficiency is, I think, we all heard you loud and clear. Before we get closer towards the end of this fantastic podcast and workshop, I would love to hear from you, Tasneem, just a little bit about the time frame here. John, Shannon, and Charlie mentioned a few times the fact that this is really a marathon. This is not a quick race, both in terms of the implementation, but also the length of the procedure and how to deal with the damages that Charlie just referred to. So first question is how long it's going to take and what it means to be in this process from the long run, and most importantly, what companies can do today, assuming that it's such a long process, in order to prevent certain cases in the future, working with you all on some of these issues today, instead of just waiting for the storm to come.
Thanks, Effie. I really wish I could answer that question easily. The long term is complicated, and in my mind, the issue of the longer term is twofold. I think, first of all, developing any kind of compliance program, and certainly a compliance program such as the ones we've been talking about here, that is full and effective for price gouging issues where complex supply chains are involved. It's a resource-intensive exercise. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes leadership involvement to put the program in place. You need to train staff, you need to test and put technology solutions together. As Charlie pointed out, you need to collate and monitor information, and then respond to complaints and concerns. All of this suggests, it's a lengthy process in putting a compliance program together. And second, as has been brought into sharp focus here from John and from Shannon on the potential private actions, the exposure can continue for a long, long time, well after restrictions have been lifted. And you add class actions into that, and clearly the stakes have been raised in terms of damages. Together, I think this makes it really critical for firms to think about developing solutions that are not just right for the current and immediate problem, but by their very design, they are also future-proof. And as future-proof as possible, not just for future pandemics or other crises that John referred to, but also able to contain the potential impact of emerging private claims. But overall, I suppose I think, I don't think that the challenge is in and of itself gargantuan. I think it's simply a case of ensuring that the system you put in place is well thought through, and that it has sufficient flexibility built into it in order to manage the ongoing risks. That, in my view, ought to provide some longevity.
This is great, and just a quick follow-up because I think it's really in our minds. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been seeing a lot of research articles, policymakers, politicians talking about price increase all over the world, including here in America, inflationary pressure. I think a few of you mentioned before that there are a couple of factors which really shape the concept of price increase, and it's really important for price gouging purposes to understand what was the impact. What's your take on that when companies or when listeners think about what they learn about pricing more generally? How did they differentiate between natural inflation and real price gouging here? Tasneem, maybe you want to share with us a few thoughts, and I'll open it up before we finish.
Sure, that sounds great. Thinking about natural price inflation, Charlie touched on the point of monitoring and tracking data on costs. I mean, that is absolutely crucial to understand your underlying cost structure and to know what is truly driving the prices of your products. Because as Shannon pointed out, there are various benchmarks in the different price gouging regulations. The price gouging regulations do allow for certain costs to be passed through. They do allow for, clear, definitive explanations of costs that cannot be controlled and that do need to be passed on to customers. They are open to that. So there is a very strong and significant need to distinguish between inflation that is cost inflation and inflation that is driven by the demand pressures and the interest to exploit potential customers. And that's where the antitrust notion of price gouging comes in, because you want to distinguish between what is truly driven by cost versus what is driven by a desire to exploit.
That's great. Anything else on
If I
this
can just
issue?
share
John, before we finish.
thoughts on that. I think it's a really important topic because I feel like this, in some ways, is almost a more dangerous time for sellers because, we sort of have this collective view that, the economy is kicking back in, the markets are open, things are sort of almost back to normal in a way, but we're still living under these states of emergency, and these price gouging restrictions and pricing restrictions are still in place. And so, on the one hand, it sort of feels one way, but if you look at the rules, they don't say it's that way. And to the extent market forces are dictating increases in price, well, that would be fine if you're not under these pricing controls. But these pricing controls sort of set aside market forces in favor of a fixed price. And so, and we're still living under that. And so now's the time to really make sure we're being careful. But I'll end it with, sort of not, as Tasneem said, unsurmountable. I mean, we've worked with folks who do pay attention to this, who look at the rules, who look at the prices, and make sure that they're staying, within the guardrails, and it's doable. And that's really, what we're here to say, is that it's a manageable process if you're paying attention to it.
That's great. I think we covered many fascinating aspects of the price gouging rules. I have a feeling that there are plenty of people out there who never heard about this term before, and that was super educational. I learned a lot from this discussion myself. And for those who actually spend a lot of time dealing with these issues already internally within their organizations, I'm sure that many of your comments and thoughts will be super helpful as they build a strategy moving forward. I think a couple of takeaway points here today. I think this issue is here to stay. If some people thought that it's going to be done by the end of the pandemic, clearly we're going to see more and more cases over the next couple of years. I think that companies should be well prepared. As we heard from all of you, I think pricing and monitoring should be a key priority for companies. Data management, training. We heard quite a bit about training of employees and executive, making sure that different parts of the organization actually work pretty well with each other on these issues. Clearly, as Tasneem mentioned before, the issues of compliance program, risk assessment early on to make sure that we adopt the right procedures, to make sure that we have good defensive strategies moving forward. And then finally, if we have cases, and some of them, as I mentioned before, could be quite long and complex, I think our analysis about the damages, about the complexity of the damages, benchmarking, and how to show whether the prices went up or down, I think these are some of the issues that people should keep in mind as they think about future cases. I learned a lot. I hope that our listeners and viewers learn a lot as well. And of course, they should feel comfortable, reach out to any of you on the economics part of the story, on the legal part of the story. Needless to say, this film just started, and I'm sure that we're all eager to see the end of this journey and the movie ahead of us. I want to thank our wonderful speakers and friends from Proskauer and Duff & Phelps Kroll. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Tasneem. Thank you, Shannon. discussion. Thank you, John, for your wonderful work on these issues. And I, Efraim Chalamish, a senior advisor with Duff & Phelps Kroll and the Kroll Institute, I'm wishing all of you a wonderful day wherever you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Effie.
Thank you all.
Thank you.